Once I sniffed that for the first time, I couldn't stop.
You couldn't stop?
Didn't want to stop. The only thing that I think about is my children and how they didn't deserve to be born with a mother with this addiction. My main goal is to get clean and stay clean.
Dallas, a city where dreams rise as high as its gleaming skyscrapers, where oil money flows like the Trinity River, and where the American promise seems written in neon lights across the downtown skyline. By day, executive jets slice through Texas blue skies. By night, luxury cars cruise past billion-dollar developments. This is the Dallas the world sees. Prosperous, powerful, unstoppable. But step into the shadows cast by those very skyscrapers, and you'll discover a shocking truth that will shatter everything you thought you knew about this Texas titan. On a single January night in 2024, volunteers armed with clipboards and compassion walked Dallas streets, counting what others choose to ignore. Their tally? 3,718 human souls experiencing homelessness. That's enough people to fill the entire American Airlines Center arena floor. But here's the number that will haunt you. 1,204 of them were children under 18. 1,204 innocent kids, sleeping in cars, shelters, or under stars that offer no protection from life's cruelest storms. Picture this. While Dallas celebrates as America's fourth largest metropolitan area, generating over $500 billion in economic activity annually, more than 1,000 children go to sleep each night without knowing where they'll wake up tomorrow. These aren't statistics. They're 12-year-old Mia doing homework by shelter light, 8-year-old Marcus clutching a stuffed animal in the back seat of his family's only remaining possession, their car. The irony cuts deep. In a city where luxury condos sell for millions, where corporate headquarters tower over the landscape like modern-day castles, the most vulnerable citizens, our children, are left to navigate a world that seems designed to forget them. Behind Dallas's prestigious image lies a reality so stark, so heartbreaking, that most choose to look away rather than confront it. But today, we're not looking away. Today, we're diving into the hidden Dallas. A place where survival isn't about climbing corporate ladders, but about finding your next meal, your next safe place to sleep, your next reason to hope. This is where our story begins, in the shadows of success, where American dreams collide with American nightmares. What you're about to witness will challenge everything you believe about prosperity, poverty, and the price we pay for turning away from those who need us most. While Dallas Independent School District celebrates academic achievements and billion-dollar budgets, a devastating secret hides in plain sight. Approximately 3,000 students within their system are homeless. 3,000 young minds trying to focus on algebra while wondering where they'll sleep tonight. 3,000 futures hanging by threads so thin, they could snap with one more crisis. Meet the reality behind the numbers. Sarah, a 16-year-old honor roll student, writes her college essays on a smartphone because her family's car doesn't have Wi-Fi. Her younger brother, just 10 years old, has learned to pack his entire life into a backpack. Everything he owns fits inside, because when you're homeless, possessions become burdens. Their mother, once a dental assistant, lost everything when medical bills from her cancer treatment consumed their savings and rent money disappeared into the healthcare void. But children like Sarah and her brother are the invisible casualties of a system that's catastrophically broken. Research shows homeless children lag behind their peers by 18 months academically, not because they lack intelligence, but because they lack the fundamental security that allows a mind to learn. How do you memorize multiplication tables when you're multiplying your own chances of survival each day? The trauma runs deeper than missed homework. These children suffer from anxiety disorders at rates 5 times higher than their housed peers. They experience chronic illnesses, developmental delays, and behavioral problems that follow them long after they find permanent housing, if they ever do. Teachers report students falling asleep in class, not from laziness, but from exhaustion born of sleeping in shifts to guard their family's meager possessions. Here's the shocking truth that will make your blood boil. While Dallas spends billions on urban development projects and sports stadiums, the city allocates comparatively microscopic amounts to prevent child homelessness. The result? A generation of young Texans growing up believing that homelessness is their fault, that they somehow deserve less than their classmates who go home to warm beds and full refrigerators. The psychological impact is devastating. Children as young as 6 develop survival instincts typically seen in war zones, hypervigilance, mistrust of adults, and the crushing belief that the world is fundamentally unsafe. They learn to be grateful for crumbs while others feast, to apologize for existing, to make themselves smaller and quieter so society can continue ignoring their pain. This isn't happening in some distant country. This is happening right now, in America's 9th largest city, where prosperity and poverty dance a deadly waltz that leaves the youngest dancers trampled beneath the feet of progress. In the summer of 2024, as Dallas temperatures soared beyond 100 degrees Fahrenheit for weeks, the city's emergency rooms saw a surge of heat-related deaths. But these weren't just statistics in medical journals. They were human beings with names, stories, and families who would never see them again. The homeless population, those without air conditioning or even basic shelter, bore the deadly brunt of Texas heat. John Martinez, a 45-year-old military veteran, was found dead in an encampment beneath Interstate 30. Beside his body lay an expired bottle of Narcan and a photo of his daughter. A daughter he'd been trying to reunite with before addiction and homelessness claimed his life. His death certificate would list heat exhaustion and fentanyl toxicity as causes, but the real killer was a system that failed him when he needed it most. The numbers are staggering and shameful. Conservative estimates suggest 20 to 30 homeless individuals die on Dallas streets each year, though the actual number is likely higher because deaths often go unreported or are misclassified. Unlike cities such as Anchorage, which meticulously tracks outdoor deaths among the homeless, Dallas has no comprehensive system for counting its lost souls. Fentanyl has turned encampments into death traps. In April 2023, Dallas police reported a spike in overdoses linked to what they called a lethal batch of the synthetic opioid. Emergency responders described scenes that haunt their nightmares. Multiple bodies discovered within hours of each other. Narcan proving ineffective against increasingly potent drug cocktails. The pattern has only worsened in 2024 and 2025. But it's not just drugs and heat claiming lives. Dallas's homeless population faces mortality rates 3 to 6 times higher than housed individuals. They die from treatable diseases, from infections that go untreated, from violence that goes unpunished, and from despair that goes unacknowledged. Winter brings its own horrors. Remember February 2021, when Texas's power grid failed and temperatures plummeted. Homeless individuals had nowhere to go when even heated buildings lost power. The cruelest irony? Many of these deaths are preventable. Every person who dies on Dallas streets represents a failure of imagination, compassion, and political will. They die not because resources don't exist, but because society has decided their lives aren't worth the cost of saving them. Maria Elena Gonzalez, a 62-year-old grandmother, spent her final days in a tent under a Dallas overpass, coughing blood from untreated tuberculosis. She'd raised 5 children, worked 2 jobs most of her adult life, and lost everything when her landlord raised rent beyond her Social Security income. She died alone, surrounded by strangers who'd become family, in the shadow of medical facilities that could have saved her if she'd had insurance or an address. These aren't just casualties, they're indictments of our collective humanity. Here's a statistic that should shock every American to their core. In Dallas, Black individuals comprise 57% of the homeless population while representing only 19% of the city's residents. This isn't coincidence. It's the mathematical manifestation of systemic racism that has weaponized housing, healthcare, and economic opportunity against communities of color for generations. The numbers tell a story of institutional failure that spans centuries. Black families in Dallas are nearly 3 times more likely to experience homelessness than their white counterparts, despite often working multiple jobs and fighting against odds that would break most people's spirits. This disparity isn't about personal choices. It's about a rigged system that has consistently denied Black Americans access to wealth-building opportunities while simultaneously criminalizing poverty. Consider the story of Deborah Washington, a 34-year-old Black mother of 3 who worked as a certified nursing assistant until COVID-19 hit. When her hours were cut and her daycare closed, she faced an impossible choice: work to pay rent or stay home to care for her children. She chose her children and lost her apartment within 2 months. The same system that applauded her as an essential worker abandoned her the moment she needed support. The data reveals layers of discrimination that compound like interest on an unpayable debt. Black veterans, who served their country with honor, represent a disproportionate share of homeless veterans in Dallas. They return from defending democracy abroad only to discover that democracy at home doesn't extend to housing justice. Of the 119 homeless veterans counted in 2024 survey, Black veterans were overrepresented despite comprising a smaller percentage of the military population. Employment discrimination adds another layer to this crisis. Black job applicants in Dallas face callback rates significantly lower than equally qualified white applicants. When you're homeless, this discrimination becomes a death sentence. You can't get a job without an address, and you can't get an address without a job. For Black homeless individuals, racism makes this catch-22 even more inescapable. The justice system compounds these inequalities. Black individuals are arrested for quality of life crimes like sleeping in public or loitering at rates far exceeding their representation in the population. These arrests create criminal records that make housing and employment even more difficult to obtain, trapping people in cycles of homelessness and incarceration. Housing discrimination, though illegal on paper, persists in practice. Black families with housing vouchers face rejection rates double those of white families with identical qualifications. Landlords use coded language and selective application processes to maintain segregation that would make 1950s Birmingham proud. The result? Generational trauma that passes from parent to child like a toxic inheritance. Black children in Dallas are more likely to experience homelessness, more likely to attend schools that lack resources, and more likely to enter adulthood already behind in a race they never had a fair chance to run. This isn't just about housing. It's about justice, dignity, and the promise that America has yet to keep. In the shadowy underbelly of Dallas's gleaming success story, a silent killer stalks the homeless population with ruthless efficiency. Fentanyl, a synthetic opioid 50 times more potent than heroin, has transformed encampments into graveyards and turned addiction from a disease into a death sentence. Walk through any homeless encampment in Dallas today, and you'll witness scenes that would make hardened emergency responders weep. Needles glint in the Texas sun like deadly jewelry scattered across cardboard floors. Bodies slump against tent walls in positions that could be sleep or could be death. And sometimes the distinction matters less than it should because help arrives too late either way. The statistics are horrifying, but the human stories behind them are worse. In April 2023, Dallas police reported a cluster of overdoses linked to what they called a lethal batch of fentanyl. Within 72 hours, 6 people died in encampments across the city. Their names were Michael, aged 28, Jennifer, aged 34, Carlos, aged 41, Patricia, aged 52, Devin, aged 23, and Thomas, aged 46. They weren't statistics. They were sons, daughters, parents, siblings, and friends whose final moments were spent fighting for breath while poison coursed through their veins. What makes fentanyl particularly deadly for the homeless population is its unpredictability and potency. Unlike heroin or prescription opioids, fentanyl requires precise dosing that's impossible to achieve with street drugs. A grain of sand's worth of difference can mean the difference between a high and death. For people self-medicating trauma, chronic pain, or the psychological agony of homelessness, this Russian roulette becomes a daily reality. Narcan, the overdose-reversing drug that has saved thousands of lives, often proves inadequate against fentanyl's strength. Emergency responders report needing multiple doses to revive overdose victims, and sometimes even that isn't enough. Volunteers who distribute Narcan kits to homeless encampments describe the heartbreak of finding people who had the antidote within arm's reach but couldn't administer it in time. The drug trade preys on homeless communities with predatory calculation. Dealers target encampments because they know desperate people make reliable customers, and homeless individuals face less police protection when violence erupts over territory or debts. Women in encampments often face sexual exploitation in exchange for drugs, creating cycles of trauma that compound addiction's grip. But here's the truth that exposes our collective moral bankruptcy. Every fentanyl death represents a person who was failed long before they touched that first lethal dose. They're veterans with untreated PTSD, abuse survivors with no access to therapy, chronic pain patients whose prescriptions were cut off, and teenagers who aged out of foster care with nowhere to go and no one who cared whether they lived or died. The drug crisis isn't separate from homelessness. It's inextricably woven into the fabric of a society that has decided some lives matter less than others. Every overdose is a scream for help that goes unheard until it's too late to answer. Dallas's response to homelessness reveals both the worst and best of human nature, often within the same city block. While politicians debate budgets and bureaucrats shuffle paperwork, people are dying on the streets. Yet amidst this systematic failure, sparks of genuine humanity illuminate paths toward real solutions. The city's housing initiatives sound impressive on paper. The REAL Time Rapid Rehousing Initiative has housed over 10,100 people since 2021, and the All Neighbors Coalition coordinates efforts across multiple agencies. These programs represent genuine progress and have prevented thousands of people from falling into homelessness. But here's the crushing reality. For every person housed, others fall into homelessness, creating a nightmarish game of musical chairs where the music never stops and the chairs keep disappearing. The math is stark and unforgiving. Dallas needs 27,500 additional affordable housing units by 2030 just to meet current demand, with median rents exceeding $1,500 monthly and minimum wage workers earning roughly $1,160 per month. Simple arithmetic reveals an impossible equation. You can't spend more than you earn indefinitely. Eventually, the numbers catch up, and eviction notices become death sentences for those without family safety nets. Shelter capacity tells an equally grim story. While Dallas housed 2,594 people in shelters during the 2024 count, approximately 3,000 more wait on lists that grow faster than spaces become available. 15 of 29 Texas counties, including rural areas surrounding Dallas, lack year-round shelters entirely. The message is clear. If you're homeless in much of Texas, your options are limited to migration or suffering. But within this systematic failure, extraordinary individuals and organizations fight battles that would humble military generals. Organizations like Family Gateway, The Bridge, and Housing Forward operate with budgets that wouldn't cover a single luxury condo purchase. Yet they save lives daily through sheer determination and volunteers who treat human dignity as sacred. Consider the work of street outreach teams who walk encampments at dawn, carrying medical supplies, food, and hope in equal measure. These modern-day saints, often formerly homeless themselves, know every resident by name, remember their stories, and celebrate small victories like someone accepting mental health treatment or reconnecting with estranged family members. The All Neighbors Coalition represents what's possible when compassion meets competence. Their coordination between public agencies, private organizations, and faith communities has created housing pipelines that move people from streets to stability. They've proven that homelessness isn't an intractable problem. It's a solvable crisis that requires sustained commitment and adequate resources. Success stories emerge daily. Veterans finding permanent housing through HUD-VA/SH vouchers, families reunited through rapid rehousing programs, and individuals overcoming addiction through integrated treatment approaches. Each success proves that given proper support, people experiencing homelessness don't just survive, they thrive. The tragedy isn't that solutions don't exist. It's that we lack the collective will to implement them at the scale required. Dallas has demonstrated that homelessness can be reduced, but elimination requires resources that match the scope of the crisis. Dallas stands as America's mirror, reflecting both our highest aspirations and our deepest shames. In this city of gleaming towers and forgotten souls, we see the true cost of a society that measures success in stock portfolios while human beings sleep on sidewalks below billion-dollar buildings. The homelessness crisis in Dallas isn't a local problem. It's a national emergency that reveals fundamental flaws in how we structure society, distribute resources, and define success. When children do homework by Shelter Light in America's 9th largest city, when veterans die alone under overpasses after serving their country, when grandmothers cough blood in tents within sight of world-class medical facilities, we face a moral reckoning that demands immediate action. The numbers that should haunt every American: 3,718 homeless individuals counted on one night, with the true number likely double that. 1,204 children without stable housing in a state that brags about its economic miracle. Conservative estimates of 20 to 30 preventable deaths annually among Dallas's homeless population. 57% of homeless individuals being Black in a city where they comprise only 19% of residents. These aren't statistics. They're indictments of our collective failure to honor the principle that all lives have equal worth. But within this crisis lies unprecedented opportunity. Dallas has proven that homelessness can be reduced through coordinated effort. Their 19% decrease since 2021 demonstrates that change is possible when communities commit to action. The city's success housing over 10,100 people through rapid rehousing programs provides a template that other cities can replicate and scale. The solutions aren't mysterious or expensive relative to our national wealth. We need 27,500 affordable housing units in Dallas alone, a number that pales compared to luxury developments sprouting across the city. We need addiction treatment that meets people where they are, mental health services that don't require insurance or addresses, and economic policies that ensure full-time work provides living wages. Most importantly, we need to reject the lie that homelessness is inevitable or that people experiencing it somehow deserve their circumstances. Every person sleeping on Dallas streets tonight represents someone's child, parent, sibling, or friend. They have names, dreams, and stories that matter as much as anyone reading these words. Your voice can change everything. Contact Texas Governor Greg Abbott and Dallas Mayor Eric Johnson. Demand they prioritize affordable housing and shelter funding over corporate subsidies. Support organizations like Family Gateway, The Bridge, and Housing Forward with donations and volunteer time. Share this documentary until everyone in your network understands that homelessness isn't someone else's problem. It's our shared responsibility. Dallas's homeless crisis is America's crisis. The question isn't whether we can solve it. The question is whether we will. What if you lived in a city where every day, someone you know, your neighbor, your coworker, your child's teacher, could die from a drug overdose? What if the streets you walk are lined with people battling addiction, not because they chose it, but because the system failed them? This isn't a hypothetical nightmare. It's the daily reality for millions of Americans. Before we dive into this shocking investigation, please subscribe to Minimalist US. Hit that subscribe button now. It helps us continue bringing you the hard-hitting stories that mainstream media won't touch. In 2024, over 84,000 Americans died from drug overdoses. That's one person every 6 minutes, dying from substances that have flooded our streets like a poison tsunami. We're diving into the 5 most drug-devastated cities in America: Baltimore, Philadelphia, San Francisco, Dayton, and Seattle, where fentanyl, meth, and despair are tearing lives apart faster than bullets in a war zone. These aren't just numbers on a government report. They're stories of people, families, and entire communities drowning in an epidemic that our leaders can't seem to stop. Picture walking down streets where stepping over overdosed bodies becomes routine. Imagine playgrounds littered with needles, where children can't play safely. Think about emergency rooms so overwhelmed with overdose victims that heart attack patients wait in hallways to die. This crisis didn't happen overnight. It traces back to the 1990s with the overprescription of opioids like OxyContin, which hooked millions on painkillers legally prescribed by doctors. Big Pharma knew these drugs were addictive, but profits mattered more than lives. As prescriptions tightened, desperate users turned to heroin, and then came fentanyl, a synthetic nightmare 50 times stronger than heroin, often mixed into other drugs without users knowing. By 2025, fentanyl is involved in nearly 70% of overdose deaths nationwide. The DEA seized enough fentanyl in 2024 to kill the entire US population twice over. Yet it keeps flooding in from Mexico and China. Why are these 5 cities ground zero for this massacre? How did it get this catastrophically bad? And what can we do to stop entire American cities from becoming open-air morgues? The answers will shock you, enrage you, and hopefully inspire you to demand change. Baltimore, Maryland stands as the undisputed king of America's overdose nightmare. A city where dying from drugs has become as common as catching the flu used to be. Picture a place where 1 in every 550 people dies from drugs each year. In 2023, Baltimore recorded over 1,000 overdose deaths, a rate of about 180 per 100,000 residents, nearly 9 times the national average. Even with a slight drop to around 900 deaths in 2024, that's still 150 per 100,000, making Baltimore the deadliest major city in America for drug users. Fentanyl is the grim reaper stalking Baltimore streets, involved in 85% of these deaths. Imagine a drug so potent that just 2 milligrams, smaller than a grain of rice, can kill you instantly. This isn't heroin anymore. This is chemical warfare against America's most vulnerable populations. Emergency rooms saw over 5,000 opioid-related visits in 2024, a 25% jump from the year before, turning hospitals into battlefield triage centers. How did Baltimore become this hellscape? The city's drug nightmare stretches back to the 1970s, when heroin took hold as steel mills and factories shut down, gutting over 100,000 jobs by the 1990s. Neighborhoods like West Baltimore, where poverty now affects 22% of residents, double the national average, became breeding grounds for addiction and despair. The 1990s brought crack cocaine, devastating communities already on their knees from economic abandonment. By the early 2000s, prescription opioids like OxyContin flooded the streets, pushed by unethical pill mills, crooked doctors and pharmacies that handed out addictive painkillers like candy. When law enforcement finally cracked down on these legal drug dealers, heroin filled the void immediately. Then, around 2015, fentanyl arrived like the angel of death, turning routine overdoses into mass casualty events. The Freddie Gray protests in 2015 exposed the city's racial and economic divides, but they also disrupted addiction services when the city needed them most, causing a 20% spike in deaths that year. Baltimore's port, a massive hub for international trade, makes it a prime entry point for drugs smuggled from Mexico and China, with cartels using the city as their East Coast distribution center. Substance use disorders grip 15% of Baltimore's adults, almost double the national 8%. Black men over 50 are hit hardest, with overdose rates 4 times higher than their white counterparts, a stark reflection of systemic inequities that have poisoned the city for generations. Mental health care is woefully underfunded, with only 40% of those needing treatment actually receiving it, leaving desperate people to self-medicate with deadly street drugs. The human cost of Baltimore's drug apocalypse extends far beyond the morgue statistics. Homelessness affects 2,500 people in the city, with drug use rates 30% higher among those living on the streets. Imagine trying to recover from addiction when your bedroom is a cardboard box and your medicine cabinet is whatever deadly poison a dealer will sell you for $5. Overdose deaths are costing Baltimore $1 billion annually in healthcare expenses, lost wages, and policing costs. But the real destruction happens to families. Child welfare cases tied to parental addiction rose 15% in 2024, leaving thousands of kids in foster care or worse, sometimes finding their parents dead from overdoses. Picture a 6-year-old calling 911 because mommy won't wake up, or a teenager selling drugs to buy food because addiction destroyed their family's income. Drug-related homicides keep Baltimore's murder rate at 50 per 100,000, among the nation's highest. These aren't just statistics. They're neighbors killing neighbors over territory, money, or drugs. Entire neighborhoods feel unsafe, trapped in a cycle of poverty, addiction, and violence that seems impossible to escape. Public health is crumbling under the weight of this crisis. 10% of drug users are infected with HIV or hepatitis C from sharing needles, turning addiction into a slow-motion death sentence even for those who survive overdoses. Businesses suffer as addiction drives away customers and employees, creating economic dead zones where legitimate commerce can't survive. Yet Baltimore refuses to surrender. The Baltimore Health Department handed out 50,000 naloxone kits in 2024, reversing 2,000 overdoses, literally bringing people back from death. Needle exchange programs cut infections by 20%, proving that harm reduction saves lives even when abstinence seems impossible. A $100 million opioid settlement from pharmaceutical companies is finally funding treatment centers, though waitlists remain criminally long. Housing First programs, which provide homes without requiring sobriety first, kept 1,000 people off the streets with a 90% success rate. This revolutionary approach recognizes that stable housing is the foundation for recovery, not the reward for it. Community groups like the Baltimore Harm Reduction Coalition train peers to save lives, offering hope where institutions have failed completely. But the crisis persists because the root causes remain. Social media posts lament federal funding cuts, with advocates calling reduced Housing First budgets heartless policy that kills people. Others argue for tougher policing, but criminalizing addiction costs 3 times more than treatment while solving nothing. Baltimore's story is one of resilience amid systemic abandonment, where communities fight to save themselves because help from above never comes. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania ranks as our second most drug-devastated city, where the Kensington neighborhood has become infamous as the East Coast's largest open-air drug market and human tragedy. Walk down Kensington Avenue, and you'll witness scenes that look more like a zombie apocalypse than an American city. People openly using drugs, some collapsed on sidewalks like discarded mannequins, others trading death in baggies in broad daylight while children walk to school. In 2023, Philadelphia's overdose rate hit 130 per 100,000 residents, with over 1,200 deaths. Even with a drop to 120 per 100,000 in 2024, that's still 6 times the national average. Fentanyl drives 80% of these deaths, but a new monster emerged in 2023: xylazine, nicknamed Trank, causing gruesome, necrotic wounds that make users look like walking corpses and contributing to 20% of fatalities. Philadelphia's descent into drug hell mirrors Baltimore's trajectory, but with its own unique horrors. Heroin took root in the 1960s, but the 1990s brought pill mills that turned Pennsylvania into prescription opioid central, hooking hundreds of thousands on legal drugs that doctors knew were addictive. By 2010, as prescriptions were finally restricted, heroin surged to fill the desperate demand. Fentanyl hit Philadelphia's streets in 2013, and by 2015, overdoses had doubled. Kensington, once a thriving working-class neighborhood where families built lives around steady factory jobs, became a post-apocalyptic wasteland after those factories closed, leaving behind 40% poverty and 15% unemployment. The neighborhood's proximity to New York's massive drug distribution networks made it a natural magnet for traffickers looking to establish territory. Emergency calls for overdoses reached 10,000 in 2024. A 10% increase that's overwhelming first responders who sometimes make multiple overdose runs to the same block within hours. Methamphetamine and cocaine use jumped 15% in 2024, as polydrug addiction becomes the new normal. Most terrifying of all, 5% of teenagers now report opioid abuse, meaning an entire generation is growing up thinking this nightmare is normal. The Trank epidemic represents a new level of horror. Unlike pure fentanyl overdoses that can be reversed with naloxone, xylazine-laced drugs cause wounds that resist healing, leading to amputations and gruesome infections. Users develop open sores that look like severe burns, earning Trank the nickname zombie drug. These wounds appear even in people who don't inject, suggesting the chemical causes tissue death throughout the body. 12% of Philadelphia adults battle substance use disorders. With mental health treatment almost non-existent, 30% of addicted residents have untreated depression, creating a perfect storm of psychological and chemical dependency. The pandemic's isolation spiked overdoses by 25% as people lost jobs, homes, and hope simultaneously. The toll of Philadelphia's drug apocalypse reaches far beyond Kensington's open-air misery. The city loses $2 billion annually to addiction through healthcare costs, lost productivity, criminal justice expenses, and social services. Hospitals are overwhelmed with 20,000 drug-related emergency room visits annually, turning medical facilities into revolving doors for the same desperate people overdosing repeatedly. Crime in Kensington is 30% drug-driven, with shootings up 15% as dealers fight for territory in a market worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But the violence isn't just between criminals. Desperate addicts commit robberies, burglaries, and assaults to fund their next fix, making entire neighborhoods unsafe for families trying to survive. The children suffer most. 1,000 kids entered foster care in 2024 due to parental addiction, overwhelming a system already stretched beyond capacity. These children often witness traumatic scenes, parents overdosing, drug deals, violence, that create lasting psychological damage. Health issues from intravenous drug use, like endocarditis, heart valve infections, rose 25% as dirty needles and contaminated drugs destroy bodies from the inside. Philadelphia's racial disparities make this crisis even more devastating. Black residents face 2.5 times the overdose risk of white residents, tied to decades of disinvestment, discriminatory policing, and limited access to quality healthcare. Communities that were already struggling with poverty and systemic racism now face the added burden of watching their neighbors die from drugs. Homelessness affects 6,000 Philadelphians, with drug use rates 40% higher among those living on the streets. Encampments line Kensington's blocks, creating temporary cities of people who've lost everything to addiction. These camps become centers of disease transmission, violence, and despair. Yet Philadelphia fights back with innovative approaches that save lives daily. The city distributed 100,000 naloxone kits in 2024, teaching family members, friends, and strangers how to reverse overdoses. Fentanyl test strips were decriminalized in 2021, allowing users to test their drugs and potentially avoid fatal doses. The controversial overdose prevention sites proposal faced massive public backlash, with critics calling them drug dens that enable addiction. But pop-up prevention sites operating in legal gray areas saved 500 lives in 2024, proving that supervised use prevents deaths even when it doesn't prevent drug use. A $200 million opioid settlement provides funding for medication-assisted treatment programs that use drugs like methadone and buprenorphine to help people recover without the agony of withdrawal. Prevention Point's needle exchange programs cut HIV infections by 50%, showing that harm reduction works even when recovery seems impossible. San Francisco, California, ranks third on our list of America's most drug-devastated cities, creating a bizarre dystopia where tech billionaires step over overdose bodies on their way to work. The Tenderloin district has become notorious for open drug use, with needles littering sidewalks like fallen leaves and overdoses occurring so frequently that they barely register as news. In 2024, San Francisco's overdose rate stands at 80 per 100,000 residents, down from 90 in 2023 but still horrifically high for a city that prides itself on progressive values and wealth. Over 800 people died from overdoses in 2023, with fentanyl dominating 75% of these deaths. The city's 8,000 homeless residents face a staggering 50% drug use rate, turning entire neighborhoods into open-air addiction treatment centers without the treatment. The crisis has roots in the 1960s hippie movement that made San Francisco synonymous with recreational drug use, but the real devastation began with crack cocaine in the 1980s and escalated with prescription opioids in the 2000s. The tech boom that made Silicon Valley famous also drove rents to an average of $3,000 for a studio apartment, pushing low-income residents into homelessness where drugs become a survival mechanism against despair and cold nights. Fentanyl hit San Francisco's streets in 2018 and tripled overdose deaths by 2020, turning the city's drug problem from manageable to catastrophic. The city's massive port facilitates drug imports from Asia and Mexico, while a shortage of 500 mental health beds leaves thousands of people with psychological problems untreated and vulnerable to self-medication. Emergency rooms logged 15,000 drug-related visits in 2024, up 10% from the previous year. Meth and cocaine use affects 20% of adults in some neighborhoods, creating complex polydrug addictions that resist traditional treatment approaches. The pandemic's isolation spiked drug use by 40% as people lost jobs, social connections, and hope simultaneously. Asian and Latino communities saw a 30% rise in overdoses in 2024, marking a troubling demographic shift as the crisis spreads beyond its traditional boundaries. These communities often face additional barriers to treatment, including language barriers, cultural stigma around addiction, and immigration fears that prevent people from seeking help. The impact extends far beyond the human toll, though that remains devastating. San Francisco spends $1.5 billion annually on the drug crisis through healthcare, social services, and law enforcement. Tourism, a major economic driver, has dropped 20% due to visible drug use that shocks visitors expecting California's postcard image. Crime increased 25% in areas with heavy drug activity, as theft and violence follow addiction like shadows. Health issues from injection drug use, including abscesses and collapsed veins, plague users who can't access clean supplies or medical care. San Francisco has responded to its drug crisis with both innovative harm reduction programs and frustrated retreats from progressive policies. The city distributed naloxone and fentanyl test strips widely, reversing 3,000 overdoses in 2024 alone. Housing First programs successfully housed 2,000 formerly homeless individuals, with $300 million in pharmaceutical settlement funds providing treatment expansion. However, public frustration with visible drug use led to policy reversals in 2024. Harm reduction sites faced community backlash, with residents demanding enforcement over compassion. Social media posts call San Francisco a failed experiment in drug policy leniency, while others demand more housing and mental health services. The city struggles to balance progressive ideals with public safety concerns as voters grow tired of stepping over human misery. Moving to our fourth-ranked city, Dayton, Ohio represents the Rust Belt's unique drug devastation. With a 2024 overdose rate of 100 per 100,000, extremely high for a mid-sized city, Dayton recorded 400 deaths in 2023. This rate rivals major metropolitan areas despite Dayton's smaller population, showing how the opioid crisis has devastated America's industrial heartland. Dayton's tragedy stems from deindustrialization that cost the city 50,000 manufacturing jobs over 2 decades, leaving entire communities without economic purpose. Poverty affects 30% of residents, creating desperation that makes deadly drugs seem like reasonable escapes from hopeless circumstances. Pill mills flooded Ohio in the 2000s, with some counties prescribing enough opioids for every resident to have a month's supply. When prescription crackdowns began, heroin filled the void immediately. Fentanyl arrived in 2016 and caused overdose rates to spike 50% within 2 years. The city's location along major interstate highways makes it a natural distribution point for drugs moving from Mexico through major cities to smaller communities across the Midwest. Non-fatal overdoses hit 2,000 in 2024, overwhelming emergency services in a city with limited resources. 10% of teenagers report drug use, meaning an entire generation is growing up in a community where drug abuse appears normal. Rural-urban drug pipelines connect Dayton to surrounding counties where treatment options are virtually non-existent. Mental health access remains severely limited, with months-long waitlists for treatment programs. The economic costs hit $500 million annually, devastating for a city Dayton's size, while families disintegrate under the pressure of addiction, poverty, and hopelessness. Yet Dayton fights back with community-driven solutions. Naloxone programs operated by local volunteers have saved hundreds of lives, while medication-assisted treatment expansion offers hope for recovery. Seattle, Washington, rounds out our top 5 as America's 5th most drug-devastated city, with a 2024 overdose rate of 70 per 100,000 residents and over 1,000 deaths in 2023. While lower than our other cities, Seattle's crisis reflects the Pacific Northwest's unique challenges with homelessness, tech inequality, and drug policy experiments that have produced mixed results. Fentanyl drives 70% of Seattle's overdose deaths, but the city also faces significant methamphetamine problems that have persisted since the 1990s. The 2008 recession brought prescription opioid abuse that transitioned to heroin and then fentanyl, following the familiar American pattern of legal drugs leading to illegal ones. Seattle's 12,000 homeless population faces extremely high drug use rates, with addiction both causing and resulting from housing instability. The tech industry boom that made Seattle wealthy also created massive inequality, where software engineers earn $200,000 annually while service workers can't afford studio apartments. This economic segregation pushes vulnerable populations toward drugs as housing becomes impossible to obtain. The city's progressive drug policies, including decriminalization efforts and harm reduction programs, have produced controversial results. Supporters point to lives saved through needle exchanges and supervised consumption sites, while critics argue that permissive policies have enabled open drug use that makes neighborhoods unsafe. Drug-related crime affects tourism and business districts, particularly around Pike Place Market and Pioneer Square, where visible drug use conflicts with Seattle's image as a clean, prosperous city. The economic impact reaches hundreds of millions annually through healthcare costs, law enforcement, and lost economic activity. Seattle's response includes extensive harm reduction programs, settlement funding for treatment expansion, and innovative approaches to addiction medicine. However, political battles over drug policy continue as residents demand both compassion for addicted individuals and safety for communities. The crisis reflects broader regional patterns, as rural Washington communities also struggle with meth and opioid problems that funnel users toward Seattle's services and drug markets. Interstate smuggling routes bring substances from Mexico and Canada, while the city's ports facilitate international drug trafficking. Mental health services remain inadequate for the scale of need, with many addicted individuals cycling between emergency rooms, jails, and the streets without receiving effective treatment. The intersection of mental illness, homelessness, and addiction creates complex problems that require coordinated responses across multiple systems. Community organizations continue providing life-saving services despite political uncertainty and funding challenges. The debate over drug policy approaches, enforcement versus treatment, abstinence versus harm reduction. Understanding America's drug crisis requires examining the interconnected web of factors that created these urban nightmares. This isn't simply about personal choices or moral failures. It's about systemic collapse that makes deadly drugs seem like rational responses to impossible circumstances. Economic devastation forms the foundation of addiction epidemics. Baltimore, Philadelphia, Dayton, and countless other cities lost hundreds of thousands of manufacturing jobs as companies moved production overseas. Entire communities built around steady employment watched their economic foundations crumble, leaving behind poverty, hopelessness, and populations vulnerable to any substance that could numb the pain of watching American dreams die. The pharmaceutical industry bears enormous responsibility for creating this crisis. Companies like Purdue Pharma knowingly marketed addictive opioids as safe for routine pain management, bribing doctors and misleading patients while earning billions from human suffering. When legal opioids became harder to obtain, Mexican cartels and Chinese chemical manufacturers filled the demand with deadlier substitutes. Racial and economic inequalities amplify addiction's impact. Black communities face higher overdose rates despite lower initial drug use, reflecting systemic healthcare discrimination and centuries of economic exclusion. Poor communities lack resources for treatment, prevention, or recovery support, turning addiction into a death sentence that wealthy areas can often survive. Mental health system collapse forces millions to self-medicate with street drugs. America's decision to close psychiatric hospitals without creating community alternatives left people with serious mental illness homeless and untreated. Depression, anxiety, PTSD, and other conditions drive people towards substances that temporarily relieve psychological pain, but ultimately destroy lives. The criminal justice approach has failed catastrophically. Arresting and imprisoning people for addiction doesn't reduce drug use. It destroys families, eliminates employment opportunities, and creates cycles of incarceration that make recovery nearly impossible. Countries that treat addiction as a health problem rather than a crime show dramatically better outcomes. Geographic factors matter enormously. Port cities like Baltimore and San Francisco become natural entry points for international drug trafficking, while interstate highways turn places like Dayton into distribution hubs. Rural areas lack treatment infrastructure, forcing people to travel hundreds of miles for help that may not be available. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated every aspect of the crisis. Isolation, job loss, and stress drove increased drug use, while disrupting treatment services and social support networks. Economic uncertainty made desperate people more willing to try dangerous substances, while supply chain disruptions made street drugs more unpredictable and deadly. Despite the overwhelming devastation, evidence-based solutions exist that can save lives and rebuild communities. The question isn't whether we know how to address this crisis, it's whether we have the political will and resources to implement what works. Harm reduction approaches save lives immediately without requiring people to achieve sobriety first. Needle exchange programs prevent HIV and hepatitis C transmission while connecting users to treatment services. Naloxone distribution has reversed millions of overdoses, literally bringing people back from death. Fentanyl test strips help users avoid fatal doses by testing substances before consumption. Safe consumption sites, controversial but effective, allow supervised drug use that prevents overdoses while providing access to medical care and social services. Portugal's decriminalization model, which treats drug use as a health issue rather than criminal behavior, has dramatically reduced overdose deaths and drug-related crime. Medication-assisted treatment using methadone, buprenorphine, and naltrexone helps people recover by managing withdrawal symptoms and drug cravings. These evidence-based treatments work better than abstinence-only approaches, with success rates above 70% when properly implemented. Housing First programs recognize that stable housing is prerequisite for recovery, not a reward for achieving sobriety. These programs show 90% success rates in keeping people housed while providing platforms for addressing addiction, mental health, and employment issues. Mental health integration is crucial because dual diagnosis, addiction combined with psychiatric conditions, affects most people with substance use disorders. Treatment programs that address both issues simultaneously achieve much better outcomes than those targeting addiction alone. Economic development in devastated communities provides alternatives to drug economies while rebuilding social fabric that prevents addiction. Job training, education, and economic investment create hope that makes recovery possible and prevents new addiction. Criminal justice reform must replace incarceration with treatment for nonviolent drug offenses. Drug courts, diversion programs, and treatment mandates cost less than prison while producing better outcomes for individuals and communities. The opioid settlement funds, over $50 billion from pharmaceutical companies, provide unprecedented resources for treatment expansion if used effectively rather than diverted to general government expenses. The 5 cities we've examined, Baltimore, Philadelphia, San Francisco, Dayton, and Seattle, represent both America's failure to protect vulnerable populations and its potential for redemption through evidence-based compassion. The choice is ours. What if you woke up tomorrow with no home, no bed, no place to feel safe? What if the streets of Ohio, your streets, were all you had? How would you survive? Right now, in the Buckeye State, thousands of people are living that nightmare. Before we dive deeper into this heartbreaking story, please subscribe to Minimalist US. Hit that subscribe button now, It helps us continue bringing you the stories that need to be told, the voices that need to be heard. In 2024, 11,759 Ohioans were homeless on a single night, a number that's climbed year after year, leaving families, kids, and veterans out in the cold. That's nearly 12,000 lives shattered. And here's the gut punch. That number jumped 3% in just 1 year, while the nation saw an 18% surge. Ohio's crisis is bad, but it's not even the worst. Yet it's still heartbreaking. Why are we letting this happen in a state known for its heartland values? Why are our neighbors sleeping under bridges? And what's it going to take to fix this? Let's dive into the numbers, because they tell a story that's hard to ignore. Back in 2015, Ohio's homeless population was around 10,000, based on estimates from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's annual point-in-time counts. These counts, taken on a single night in January, give us a snapshot of people in shelters, transitional housing, or living unsheltered, on streets, in cars, or in places not meant for humans. By 2018, the number of Ohioans accessing homelessness services had skyrocketed to 76,478, a 30.8% increase from 2012, while the state's overall population grew by just 1.3%. That's a crisis growing 24 times faster than the population. In 2019, the count was 10,654, with 2,036 in Columbus alone, a 7% jump from the year before. By 2022, it was over 10,000 again, and in 2023, it hit 11,386, a 6.9% increase in 1 year. Then, in 2024, the number reached 11,759, up 3% from 2023, according to HUD's 2024 Annual Homelessness Assessment Report. That's a steady climb, and every number is a person, a child, a parent, a grandparent struggling to survive. But these numbers don't tell the whole story. The 2024 count of 11,759 is likely an undercount. Point-in-time counts miss people who are doubled up, crashing with friends or family, living in motels, or hiding in plain sight. The methodology itself is flawed, asking volunteers to count people who are often trying to remain invisible. The hidden reality is staggering. Experts estimate the real number of Ohioans experiencing homelessness over a year could be 7 times higher, potentially over 70,000. In 2018 alone, 23,000 people in Cuyahoga County, home to Cleveland, faced homelessness, with nearly 3,000 students in Cleveland's public schools counted as homeless. In 2019, 35,000 Ohio students struggled with homelessness at some point during the school year. Imagine that. A child in your kid's classroom, carrying the weight of not knowing where they'll sleep tonight. These point-in-time surveys, conducted on cold January nights, capture only those visible to volunteers and outreach workers. They miss the families staying in overcrowded apartments, the teenagers sleeping in cars, the elderly hiding their homelessness out of shame. Weather conditions during the count dramatically affect numbers, as people seek deeper shelter during harsh winters. Some regions lack sufficient volunteers or resources to conduct thorough counts, particularly in rural areas where homelessness might be scattered across vast distances. The timing of these counts also matters. January represents the peak of winter hardship, but homelessness fluctuates throughout the year. Summer months might see different patterns, with more people living outdoors but also more transient populations that are harder to track. Seasonal work, agricultural cycles, and tourism patterns all affect homeless populations in ways that a single night count can't capture. Educational data provides another lens into the crisis. School districts are required to identify homeless students under the McKinney-Vento Act, and their numbers often exceed point-in-time counts significantly. This suggests that family homelessness, in particular, is far more widespread than official tallies indicate. When we look at the broader picture, considering all forms of housing instability, the numbers become truly alarming. The discrepancy between official counts and reality reveals a system that's failing to capture the full scope of the crisis. Families experiencing homelessness often remain hidden, staying with relatives or friends in overcrowded conditions, moving frequently to avoid detection. Single adults might sleep in their cars, in 24-hour businesses, or in places that aren't traditionally considered homeless encampments. Veterans might couchsurf rather than access services due to pride or mistrust of systems that have failed them before. This undercount has serious policy implications. Funding for homeless services is often tied to point-in-time count numbers, meaning communities with hidden homeless populations receive fewer resources than they actually need. Who's bearing the brunt of this crisis? The faces of Ohio's homeless are diverse, but the patterns are stark and revealing. In 2024, nearly 80% of Ohio's homeless were sheltered, in emergency shelters or transitional housing, but 20% were unsheltered, living on the streets or in encampments. That's a 29% increase in unsheltered homelessness since the pandemic began, making the crisis more visible than ever. In Columbus, the 2025 point-in-time count found 2,556 people homeless, a 7.4% jump from 2024, with 455 living outside, though that's a slight 1% drop from the year before. The increase in sheltered homelessness coupled with a small decrease in unsheltered populations suggests that while more people are experiencing homelessness, communities are working to move people indoors, though capacity remains severely limited. Families with children make up a devastating portion of this crisis. 35.3% in Columbus in 2019, and statewide. A third of those accessing services in 2018 were kids under 18, including 2,258 infants not even a year old. Picture a baby, not even walking yet, with no crib, no home. That's the reality for thousands. These aren't just statistics, they represent children whose earliest memories will be shaped by instability, uncertainty, and the trauma of not having a safe place to call home. Family homelessness has unique characteristics that make it particularly heartbreaking. Unlike single adults who might choose to remain hidden, families often have no choice but to engage with systems, schools, healthcare, social services, that can identify their housing status. This means children experiencing homelessness face additional challenges. Frequent school changes, difficulty maintaining friendships, stigma from peers, and the psychological burden of adult worries at a young age. Parents experiencing homelessness with children face impossible choices daily. Whether to split up the family to access gender-segregated shelters, how to maintain employment while managing constant housing instability, and how to protect their children's mental health while dealing with their own trauma and stress. The impact on child development is profound and long-lasting. Studies show that children who experience homelessness have higher rates of developmental delays, behavioral problems, and academic struggles. They're more likely to repeat grades, change schools frequently, and have difficulty forming stable relationships. The stress of homelessness affects brain development, particularly in young children, potentially creating lifelong challenges with learning, emotional regulation, and social skills. Many homeless children exhibit symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, including hypervigilance, difficulty sleeping, and emotional outbursts. Older adults represent another growing and vulnerable segment of Ohio's homeless population, facing challenges that are often life-threatening. Between 2012 and 2018, homelessness among those aged 55 to 64 jumped 85%. And for those 65 and older, it soared by 208%. These are people who've worked their whole lives, paid taxes, raised families, and contributed to their communities, now facing health crises with nowhere to recover. Their risk of early death is sky-high, with homeless older adults facing emergency room visits and mortality rates far above their housed peers. The challenges facing older homeless adults are particularly severe and complex. Age-related health conditions become life-threatening when you're living on the streets or in inadequate shelter. Diabetes becomes unmanageable without refrigeration for insulin or regular meals. Heart conditions worsen without proper rest and medical care. Mobility issues make it nearly impossible to navigate shelter systems or access services that require walking long distances or climbing stairs. Many older adults experiencing homelessness are dealing with fixed incomes that haven't kept pace with rising housing costs, making it impossible to afford rent even with Social Security or pension benefits. The median income for homeless adults over 50 is often less than $700 per month, while average rent for even a studio apartment far exceeds this amount. Medical expenses further drain limited resources, forcing impossible choices between medication and food, between doctor visits and shelter fees. Unaccompanied youth represent 3.7% of Columbus's homeless population in 2019, often kids aging out of foster care or fleeing unsafe homes. These young people face unique vulnerabilities, including higher rates of exploitation, trafficking, and violence. Without family support systems, they're often ill-equipped to navigate adult responsibilities while still dealing with the trauma that led to their homelessness in the first place. Many have experienced abuse, neglect, or family rejection, particularly LGBTQ+ youth who are disproportionately represented among homeless young people. Veterans represent another tragic face of this crisis. While their numbers dropped nearly 15% since 2020 thanks to targeted programs, any veteran on the streets is one too many. These are men and women who served our country, who put their lives on the line for our freedom, now abandoned by the very society they protected. Many struggle with PTSD, traumatic brain injuries, or other service-connected disabilities that make civilian life challenging. The transition from military structure to civilian chaos can be overwhelming, particularly when combined with housing instability and limited support systems. The racial disparities in Ohio's homelessness crisis are shocking and impossible to ignore. In 2018, Black Ohioans made up 12.4% of the state's population but 48.8% of those accessing homelessness services, while white Ohioans, 81% of the population, were just 45.4% of the homeless. That's a glaring imbalance that didn't emerge in a vacuum. It's the direct result of centuries of systemic racism that has shaped American housing policy. These disparities are rooted in decades of redlining, discriminatory lending practices, and unequal access to jobs and quality education. Black families are more likely to face eviction, experience poverty, and encounter housing instability, putting them at dramatically higher risk of homelessness. In Cuyahoga County, a staggering 80% of those entering shelters in 2018 were people of color. This isn't just a housing crisis. It's a racial justice crisis that's tearing Ohio's communities apart. Historical practices like redlining, which began in the 1930s, systematically denied Black families access to homeownership in desirable neighborhoods, concentrating poverty and limiting wealth accumulation for generations. The GI Bill, which helped millions of white veterans buy homes after World War II, largely excluded Black veterans through discriminatory lending practices and segregated housing markets. These policies created a wealth gap that persists today, leaving Black families with less generational wealth to fall back on during economic crises. Contemporary discrimination continues to perpetuate these disparities. Black renters are more likely to be rejected for apartments, offered higher rents, and shown fewer properties than white renters with identical qualifications and income. The criminal justice system also plays a significant role, as Black Ohioans are disproportionately likely to have criminal records, which create additional barriers to housing when landlords routinely screen out applicants with any criminal history. The intersection of race and homelessness also affects access to services and treatment within the homeless system itself. Studies show that Black individuals experiencing homelessness often wait longer for permanent housing placements, receive fewer resources, and face additional barriers to accessing mental health and substance abuse treatment. Cultural competency in service delivery remains a significant challenge, with many programs designed without consideration for the unique experiences and needs of communities of color. Native American populations, while smaller in Ohio, also experience homelessness at rates far exceeding their representation in the general population. Hispanic and Latino communities face additional barriers including language access, immigration status concerns, and cultural factors that may prevent engagement with traditional homeless services. Where is this crisis unfolding across Ohio? Columbus stands as ground zero, with 2,556 homeless individuals in 2025, representing a 7.4% jump from the previous year. Franklin County, where Columbus sits, faces a looming disaster. A 2024 report warned that homelessness could spike 68% by 2028 if current trends continue unchecked. This projection isn't just speculation. It's based on current trajectories of housing costs, wage stagnation, and service capacity limitations. Cleveland's Cuyahoga County reported 23,000 people experiencing homelessness in 2017, with 2,750 students in Cleveland public schools affected. The urban concentration of homelessness in Cleveland reflects broader patterns of economic disinvestment, population loss, and housing stock deterioration that have plagued Rust Belt cities for decades. Cincinnati's homeless population included 1,381 children in 2023, representing 23% of the city's total homeless count, highlighting the particular vulnerability of families in Ohio's third-largest city. But homelessness isn't confined to Ohio's major metropolitan areas. Appalachian Ohio, encompassing 32 rural counties, faces unique challenges that urban areas don't encounter. With only 792 of the state's 3,314 emergency shelter beds located in rural areas as of 2022, vast stretches of southeastern Ohio have virtually no emergency housing infrastructure. Places like Adams and Brown counties, each with approximately 500 homeless individuals, rely on shelters so small they can house fewer than 20 people at a time. Rural homelessness often remains invisible, hidden in the hollers and backwoods where poverty has persisted for generations. The decline of coal mining, manufacturing job losses, and agricultural consolidation have left entire communities economically devastated. When the last major employer closes its doors, families face impossible choices. Abandon the land their families have called home for generations, or stay and face increasing poverty and housing instability. Transportation barriers compound rural homelessness challenges. Without reliable public transit, accessing services might require traveling 50 or 100 miles, an impossible journey for someone without a car or gas money. Mental health and addiction treatment services are particularly scarce in rural areas, leaving individuals with dual diagnoses, homelessness combined with untreated mental health or substance abuse issues, with virtually no support options. The opioid crisis has hit rural Ohio particularly hard, with overdose rates in some Appalachian counties exceeding national averages by significant margins. Addiction often leads to job loss, family breakdown, and eventually housing loss, creating a pipeline from substance abuse to homelessness that rural communities are ill-equipped to address. What's driving this crisis? There's a perfect storm of interconnected factors, and it starts with housing affordability. Ohio faces a shortage of 270,399 affordable homes for extremely low-income renters, meaning for every 100 low-income households, there are only 44 affordable units available. In Franklin County, the situation is even more dire. Just 26 affordable units exist for every 100 households that need them. This scarcity creates fierce competition for limited affordable housing and drives up prices across the entire rental market. Rent increases are crushing Ohio families at an unprecedented rate. From 2021 to 2023, the average rent for a two-bedroom apartment in Ohio jumped 18%, while median rents in central Ohio rose 34% from 2017 to 2022, outpacing the national increase of 29%. These aren't gradual adjustments. They're dramatic spikes that have outstripped wage growth by enormous margins. Over 700,000 Ohioans, more than 1 in 15 residents, spend over half their income on rent, leaving them perpetually one missed paycheck, one medical emergency, one car repair away from eviction. In 2018, 70% of the lowest income households were severely rent-burdened, spending more than half their income on housing costs, compared to less than 1% of higher income earners. This creates a two-tiered housing system where economic mobility becomes nearly impossible for those at the bottom. The wage-to-rent gap reveals the fundamental economics driving homelessness. Ohio's minimum wage in 2018 was $8.30 an hour, but to afford a two-bedroom apartment at fair market rent, a worker needed to earn $15.25 an hour working full-time. A single mother working minimum wage would have had to work 73 hours per week, nearly 2 full-time jobs, just to afford basic housing. This gap has only widened in recent years as rents have increased faster than wages. Poverty rates across Ohio tell the story of economic distress that creates pathways to homelessness. In 2018, 18.3% of Cuyahoga County residents and 35.2% of Clevelanders lived below the federal poverty line, with Cleveland's child poverty rate reaching a staggering 48.7%. These aren't temporary setbacks. They represent generational cycles of poverty that trap families in instability. The end of COVID-19 relief programs created a perfect storm for housing displacement. Eviction moratoriums and rental assistance programs, including the $30 million Ohio received from the American Rescue Plan Act in 2021, temporarily stemmed the tide of housing displacement. These programs kept hundreds of thousands of Ohioans housed during the economic uncertainty of the pandemic. However, when federal funding expired and moratoriums lifted, a wave of delayed evictions swept across the state. When those federal funds ran dry, evictions surged, and housing instability skyrocketed across Ohio. In Cleveland alone, 12 evictions occurred every day in 2018. That's 12 families losing everything every single day, and this was before the pandemic even began. The post-pandemic surge has been even more devastating, with eviction rates climbing as rental assistance programs ended and economic pressures intensified. Mental health and addiction create additional, often overlooked pathways into homelessness. In 2018, 67% of Ohio's homeless population had a mental health diagnosis, while 19.5% had a documented substance use disorder. These conditions often intersect, creating complex challenges that require coordinated, specialized treatment approaches that are rarely available. In Summit County in 2022, 19% of homeless individuals battled addiction, outpacing other health conditions as a primary barrier to housing stability. Franklin County witnessed a devastating 76% increase in overdose deaths among the homeless population from 2019 to 2021, highlighting the deadly intersection of housing instability and substance abuse. Homeless youth face particular vulnerability. 79% abuse opioids to cope with trauma, according to Ohio State University research. This isn't just a personal struggle. It's a systemic failure that reflects inadequate mental health services, limited addiction treatment options, and barriers to care that keep people trapped in cycles of homelessness and substance abuse. The criminalization of homelessness makes recovery and stability nearly impossible. Cincinnati's Ordinance 910 to 12 bans panhandling in certain areas, while Columbus's 2018 ordinance restricts how and where people can ask for help. This is ours. Continue failed approaches that waste lives and money, or embrace solutions that work. Which future will we choose?